All right, welcome. Today we're diving deep into a really unique perspective on cosmic history. It's drawn directly from our source material, which frames the entire universe not as some cosmic accident, but as a deliberately designed and, well, deployed system.
So, to get us started, the source material kicks things off with a simple but really powerful question. Imagine you're walking along and you find a book that just looks ancient. How would you actually figure out how old it is? This little thought experiment, it's the key to unlocking this entire argument.
And it lays out two totally different ways to go about it. The first way is what the source calls the inspector's method. You pull out your tools, you chemically analyze the ink, you measure the decay of the paper. But then there's the second way, the author's method, which is, well, a lot easier. You just open the cover and read the copyright date. This one analogy, measuring the ink versus reading the copyright, that's the lens for this entire worldview.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to look at why the source thinks standard measurement is a broken yardstick. Then we'll get into this idea of a functionally mature universe. After that, we'll see how this view tries to solve some so-called impossible paradoxes. We'll explore its foundation in an unbreakable witness. And finally, it all comes down to measuring versus knowing. So let's jump in.
All right, first up, the inspector's broken yardstick. This is all about what the source sees as the big mistake in just measuring the present and trying to stretch that measurement back in time to guess what the past was like. Right off the bat, the source material just throws a wrench into a core scientific assumption. This idea that if something looks really complex, it absolutely must have taken a super long time to form. The argument here is that maybe, just maybe, that's a huge miscalculation.
So in this story, right, the inspector gets dropped into a video game world. He pulls out all his instruments, he measures the pixelated mountains, and he's like, wow, this place must be ancient. He's using what's called a uniformitarian assumption. Basically, he's assuming that the slow processes we see happening today have always happened at the exact same speed.
But here's the twist. He's completely wrong. The game world didn't form over millions of years. The power button was just hit. According to this view, applying these long-age calculations to a system that was born mature is, and I'm quoting here, a syntax error. You're measuring the details perfectly, but you're completely missing the bigger picture of how it all began. So, if the inspector's method is flawed, what's the alternative? Well, that takes us right to the core thesis of the source material, this idea of a functionally mature universe. The big idea here is what the source calls functionally mature initialization. The universe was created ready to run, just like that video game. And this means that all those things that make it look old, they aren't actually a record of history. They're just necessary structural features built in from the very beginning. And the text gives some pretty wild examples to explain this. Adam, the first man, wasn't created as a baby, but as a full-grown adult. Trees weren't seeds. They already had fruit on their branches. And this is a big one. Starlight was created already on its way to Earth. In this view, even things like tree rings or radioactive isotopes aren't there to be clocks. They're structural bones, things a tree needs to stand upright or a rock needs to be stable from moment one. And according to the source, this isn't just some vague, young universe idea. This principle actually points to a very specific startup date for the cosmos, around 5,786 years ago, based on its own internal records. Okay, so you're probably thinking, wait a minute, if you squeeze all of history into that short of a time, how do you deal with all the scientific contradictions? Well, that's what we're getting into next. The source tackles these paradoxes head-on. First up is a big one, the heat problem. Look, the source acknowledges that if you cram billions of years of things like nuclear decay into just a few thousand years, you generate an insane amount of heat. We're talking melt the Earth into a puddle kind of heat. So, where did it all go? The source proposes this really interesting mechanism it calls neutrino shunting. The idea goes something like this. The architect of the system basically converted all that dangerous excess heat into neutrinos, these tiny, harmless particles, and just vented them right out into space. Think of it like a cosmic pressure release valve. And this way of thinking also gets applied to another huge cosmic mystery, dark matter and dark energy. The standard view says 95% of the universe is made of this invisible stuff just to make the math work. But this perspective says that's just a fudge factor. It's like inventing invisible ghosts to hold the universe together because the model refuses to consider an outside force. What the text calls the architect's hand is actively doing the job. This reinterpretation goes all the way from the stars down to biology. The source suggests that dinosaurs weren't ancient ancestors at all. Instead, they were biological malware, the result of forbidden genetic mixing. And the Great Flood? In this view, it wasn't just a big rainstorm. It was a system format, a total hard reset designed to delete these corrupted biological files and completely reboot the world.
So you have to be wondering, what is all this based on? Where are these radical ideas coming from? Well, the source doesn't anchor its claims in physical stuff you could measure. It anchors everything in what it calls an unbreakable chain of human testimony. And here's the core of that claim. The entire timeline, the whole story, is anchored to one single massive event at Mount Sinai, an event that the source says was witnessed by over 3 million people, all at the same time, all seeing and hearing the exact same thing.
The modern analogy the source uses for this is, get this, a blockchain, a distributed ledger. The argument is, how could you possibly fake or hack a memory that's being held and cross-verified by 3 million different people at once, who then go and pass that exact same memory directly to their own children? The argument is, you can't. It's a non-hackable human blockchain. And to prove this data hasn't been corrupted over time, the source lays out what it calls an unbroken chain of custody, a documented, named line of leaders from Moses, one after the other, all the way to the present day, all tasked with ensuring this live signal was passed down perfectly intact. Which brings us right back to where we started, with that old book on the ground and this fundamental choice we have to make. This gets us to the final key, measuring versus knowing. So, the source concludes that if you only rely on physical measurements, the inspector's method, you're using a broken ruler. It's like being in a dark room and trying to measure the darkness, when you could just look for the light switch. The real answer, it argues, isn't found by measuring the decaying ink on the page. It's found by listening to the author's live signal. And this brings us to the final, provocative thought from the source, which really sums up this whole worldview. It challenges every single one of us to decide which method holds more weight, the forensic audit of physical decay or the unbroken testimony of a witness. It leaves us wondering if we're living in a universe of pure chance or one that has an author, a purpose, and a signal that we might just be able to tune into.